Hello everyone, welcome to this video about billable expenses in Xero and the Xero API. I'm Adam Moore, product owner of the Xero Accounting API, and in this video I'm going to demo billable expenses in Xero and then show you how you can do exactly the same things using the Xero API. Conceptually, billable expenses are just things that a business has to buy and they charge them on to their customers. So what I'm going to demo today is a software company called Software House, and just imagine that they get a bunch of outside contractors to help them build their software, and they charge those contractor costs onto their customers. So imagine that I've just received an invoice on my desk from one of my UX designers. He's a contractor, and so I'm going to go and pop that into Xero. So I'm just going to jump into my purchases section, create a new purchases invoice or a bill, and just pop in those details. So let's say, fortunately, he's called Mr. Designer. Pop in the rest of those details. On the line amount, we might say 5 days UX design. Just give it a quantity and a unit amount. And I've got a contractor's expenses account set up. Cool, and that's how you create a simple bill in Xero. But what we now have is this link down the bottom, which is assign expenses to a customer. So what that means is for each, you can assign each different line item to a different customer potentially, but in this example we just have the one line item, keep it easy, and we're going to assign this to a customer called Mr. Customer. Click OK, and now I can see that this will be created as a billable expense. So I'm going to go ahead and approve that invoice, and behind the scenes that's creating a billable expense for Mr. Customer, and you can see those by running your report that shows you your outstanding billable expenses, or the next time you raise a sales invoice for Mr. Customer, you'll be prompted to charge on these costs. So let's say I'm doing all my accounting today, so I'm going to go ahead and just do that now. So I'm going to go into the sales section of Xero, create a new sales invoice, and I'm charging my customer, Mr. Customer. Just pop in the invoice details, and Xero is now going to prompt me that Mr. Customer has this outstanding billable expense. Click on that, and it's the 5 days of UX design that we just put in the bill for from Mr. Designer. So I'm going to say yes please, pop that onto my sales invoice, and it pulls through a few of the details. The description, quantity, unit price. All I have to do is decide which account I'm going to assign that to. So this is my sales invoice, so assign it to my sales account. I can also change the unit price if I want, so I might add a bit of markup. So let's just add 10% on there, and that's pretty much all there is to it. So I can go ahead and approve that invoice, and that billable expense has run its full life cycle now from purchase to sale. Pretty straightforward in the UI, and you can do exactly the same thing using the Xero API. And what I'm going to do to demonstrate that is fire up a public app that I've created called Adam's Hacky Public App. What I might just do first of all is just disconnect it, just show you from the start. Connect to Xero. It's going to go through and go through the OAuth flow like all the apps that integrate with Xero. This particular version is the public app. So I come to this screen where I can pick my Xero organization I'm connecting to. I'm going to connect to Software House, which is the one I was just demoing before. Cool, and I'm in. So as I said, as I've named it, Adam's Hacky Public App, it's very basic. Basically just choose your method that you're going to use, the endpoint, pop it in here, and then there's a text area for a XML payload. So to do the same workflow, we're basically going to do the same thing. So last time we started off by creating a purchase invoice, and we're going to do the same thing via the API. So we're going to do a post to the invoices endpoint. Fortunately, I've prepared some XML earlier. just to save me some typing. Cool, so what we're going to do is create an API invoice, which is a bill. This time the invoices come from Mr. Tester for some testing. I'm going to create it with the status of authorized straight away, but you could do a draft. And on this line item, I've been charged for 5 days of testing, 800 a day, and again to my contractor expense account. So I'm going to go ahead and submit this API request. Cool. I'm just going to view the source, and this is the response that I've got back from the API. So I can see that invoice has been created successfully. I've got given an invoice ID, and each line item has been given a line item ID, which I'll come back to in a moment because it's important for creating the billable expense. But first of all, just to prove I'm not a liar, let's just make sure that's been created in Xero. If I come to my purchase invoices, I should have 2 invoices now, the one I created before for Mr. Designer and this one here for Mr. Tester, which has come through from the API. You can see down the bottom that it's coming from the API with all the details. The only thing is, it's not a billable expense yet. There's been no billable expense created because that's a separate request in the API. Cool. So what I'm going to do is now create that billable expense, and just to confuse you, we do that using the link transactions endpoint. Actually, before I go ahead and do that, as you saw in the UI, when you create the billable expense, you have to know which customer you're assigning it to. So first I'm going to need to get the contact ID from Mr. Customer so that I can bill the expense onto him. So I'm just going to do a get contacts. Cool. And I can see Mr. Customer as the top contact there, so I can use his contact ID. Coming back to my app, now I'm ready to do my post to link transactions to create the billable expense. Again, I'm going to steal some XML that I've created earlier, but I haven't put in the details yet. So just to quickly explain what each of these elements are, the first 2 are the source transaction ID and the source line item ID. What we need to put in there is the invoice ID and the line item ID from our bill that we've created. Why have we made it complicated and not just called it invoice ID and line item ID? In future, we envisage we might use this endpoint for other types of transactions like spend money bank transactions or expense claims, things like that. So we've kept the terms generic, but for the moment, all we can use is the invoice ID. So I'm going to come back to my response from my invoice creation and grab the invoice ID from that. And the line item ID as well, because remember, billable expenses are done on a line-by-line basis. And from my get contacts response, I'm going to get the contact ID from Mr. Customer. So basically I'm saying this line item from this invoice, I want to create a billable expense for this customer. So I'm going to go ahead and submit that. Cool, it's come back successfully. So I'll create a link transaction for this invoice, this line item, and it's going to this customer. So currently it's got a status of approved and it's a type billable expense. As I said, at the moment, billable expense is the only type of link transaction we have, but there might be more in the future. Great, so that's pretty much the bill side of the process. Let's just refresh the UI view and we'll just make sure that billable expense has been created. Cool. So just see that text has been added here saying that this is now a billable expense for Mr. Customer, and we can move ahead and do the sales part of the transaction. So if I come back to my app, and now in this case we know that there's a billable expense for Mr. Customer because we just created it, but let's imagine we don't, or we just want to double check that he doesn't have any other existing ones. So I'm going to do a get on the link transactions endpoint, and I'm going to filter by Mr. Customer's contact ID. If I just come back to the get customer and grab his contact ID, so where contact ID is blah, and I can also add to that a filter on the status as well. So and status equals approved. So I'm going to head and run that. Cool, that's finished successfully. And we can see actually Mr. Customer only has this one link transaction, and it's got status of approved, so it's ready to go onto a sales invoice. Cool, so now I know all that. I'm going to come back to my app, and I'm going to create the sales invoice for Mr. Customer. So we're going to do a post to the invoices endpoint. Again, some XML I've created earlier. Main difference this time is that it's an ACREC invoice, so it's a sales invoice. It's for Mr. Customer, and it's for the 5 days of testing. I haven't added on a markup this time. We'll just leave it at $800. Go ahead and submit that. Cool. And that sales invoice has been created. This is the response. And again, we'll need to keep note of the invoice ID and the line item ID because we'll use those in a minute to update the link transaction. Firstly, let's just double check our sales in Xero, make sure that invoice is there. Cool, so we've got the one we created earlier. There's actually this one, and the one we've just created now via the API is this one. Yep, you can see there in the history at the bottom, it's created via the Xero API. But at the moment it's just a standard sales invoice and it hasn't been linked to the billable expense, so that billable expense is still sitting there behind the scenes outstanding. So what we need to do is update that billable expense with the sales details. So we do that by doing a post to the link transactions endpoint, and we're going to update that particular link transaction. So I'm going to get the link transaction ID. Stick that on the end of my URL. And then I'm going to use the last bit of pre-prepared XML. Cool. And so the only thing I'm going to update is the target transaction ID and the target line item ID. Again, we've given them the generic name because we're not quite sure if we're going to add more types of target transaction in the future. But for the moment and for this example, it's always going to be a sales invoice. So I'm going to grab that sales invoice, and the invoice ID we use as the target transaction ID, and the line item ID will become the target line item ID. So I'm just going to hit submit there, and hopefully we'll finalize this billable expense. Cool. So successful response. You can see the link transaction has now been updated with the target details. So this is the details of the sales invoice and the line item on that sales invoice. The status has now been updated to build, and yeah, that's about all there is to it. Just for completeness, let's check that out in the UI. I'll just refresh our sales invoice. and we can see that this line item has now been tagged as a billable expense. So just as we did in the UI, we've now gone through the full happy life cycle of a billable expense. So I know that was a little bit more complicated via the API, so just to recap, there's the two halves, the purchasing half and the sale half. Your integration may only deal with one or the other, but I've gone through the complete flow just to show you how it goes end to end. So when you're doing the purchase side, you have to create the bill first. Do that by a normal post to the invoices endpoint. You then need to work out which customer you're going to on-bill it to, so you'll need to get the customers by doing a get contacts. Then you create the link transaction, which is the billable expense, by a post to the link transactions endpoint. When you're doing the sales side of things, before you create an invoice for a particular customer, you're going to need to retrieve any link transactions that might exist for that customer. So you can do a get link transactions using the filter of contact ID, and you can add the filter of status on that as well. You then create the sales up invoice for that customer, and finally you update the link transaction just to close out that billable expense. So yeah, as I said, that's the happy path for a billable expense. There's obviously lots more things you can do, updating, deleting, what happens when invoices get voided, and all sorts of things. So we've put as much as we can up on the Developer Center, so check that out at developer.xero.com. Otherwise, if you've got any questions that aren't addressed there, please throw them up on community at community.xero.com, and we'll do our best to respond. Thanks very much for listening.